Well, good evening and welcome to the library. I'm Mark Bartlett, the head librarian. Thank you for coming out tonight and joining us for our first event of October. I appreciate you all coming out on what has been kind of a long, gray, dark day out there. We were all wondering if the sun was ever going to show. I appreciate everyone coming to hear our guest speaker tonight, Mr. Richard Rubin, who came down from Maine today and is here to give us a very special talk and presentation, helping us mark the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I. Before I introduce our speaker, let me please ask you if you have a cell phone, pager, a laptop, an iPad, anything that's electronic and might make a noise, just take it out and silence it for us for the next hour. The Society Library relies on members for support above and beyond the membership fees, which cover 27% of the annual budget, and our fall annual appeal is on right now. We are raising general support to have great events like tonight, to buy books for our collection, to run the children's library, to keep the building cool in the summer and warm in the winter, and to continue to provide the service that we are proud of. So thank you so much for considering a gift to the library. It's a real pleasure to introduce Richard Rubin, whose latest book is The Last of the Doughboys, The Forgotten Generation and the Forgotten World War. Mr. Rubin is also the author of a book called Confederacy of Silence, which is sitting over here and you can have a look at. And he's a journalist who's been writing extensively for The Atlantic, the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, Smithsonian, and New York. His book is full of the remarkable candid memories of foot soldiers, nurses, ambulance drivers, and loggers. He was able to track down a number of the centenarians ranging in age from 103 to 111, and I can tell from reading Mr. Rubin's book that this was really a life-changing experience for him to interview these veterans and to be in the presence of these remarkable members of the AEF who had lived on and experienced the 21st century. As a side note, we have a few books on display tonight which I wanted to draw your attention to, and if you have a moment to look at them after, do so. A number of them are titles that Mr. Rubin used in his research, and I was really pleased this week to read in an early section of his book his discussions of the American writer and veteran Arthur George Empey, whose work we have a number of volumes of over on the table. Finally, let me reassure you there will be lots of time for questions and answers, and we do have books for sale outside, compliments of the corner bookstore. So please join me now in a warm welcome to Richard Rubin.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to the library for inviting me. It's a great honor for me to be here. As you can see, the subtitle of my book is The Forgotten Generation and Their Forgotten World War. I always get questions from people whenever I speak. Somebody always asks what the origin of the term Doughboys is, which makes me wish I had chosen a different title. And every once in a while, I'll get an email that says, "Love the book, but how can you call World War I a forgotten World War?" Which briefly makes me wish I had chosen a different subtitle as well. But I don't think it's, I think it's absolutely indisputable that World War I, as great as it was, as massive a force of history as it was, has been forgotten in this country, which is really a very strange thing to say, in part because it was such an important event, and in part because once upon a time, the war was anything but forgotten in this country. I contend, in fact, that there are more World War I monuments in this country than monuments to any other war. I can't tell you how many towns I've been to that don't have a Civil War monument or a World War II monument, but do have something to the First World War. And in fact, it was such a monument that I think was an early part of my interest in the subject. This is the monument, the World War I monument in my hometown in Westchester County. And that building you see behind it is the library, which my parents essentially used as daycare when I was a kid, even though they didn't have a formal daycare program. But I spent a lot of time out of the library in the park behind it, and I spent a lot of time looking at this statue, utterly fascinated by it. It hasn't aged all that well, as you can see. In the book, I describe it in its current incarnation as looking like one of those bank die packs exploded all over it. But it was a very dignified statue to me when I was a kid. And one of the things I noticed about it was that I never really saw anybody else stop and look at it, which was really, even as a child, I found quite striking. But I guess I've always noticed things like this, and I know that everywhere you go, even in this city, especially I think in this city, there are World War I monuments, just absolutely everywhere. If you have your eyes open, you can't help but see them. One of the most interesting to me is this. This is actually one of two identical plaques inside the entrance to Lord and Taylor down on 39th Street. And I know it's not a very good picture, and the reason it's not a very good picture is it's actually impossible to stand directly in front of it. They've constructed new doors that make it impossible for you to stand in front of it, so you have to actually stand to the side. But the contribution of Lord and Taylor's employees to the war effort was so important that after the war they put up two of these plaques commemorating all the men and women who worked at the store who were involved in the war in some way or another. It's the kind of thing I wonder how many people even notice that it's there today, and yet it is there, hiding in plain sight. And as I said, there's stuff all over this city that's hiding in plain sight. If you just walk 6 blocks in that direction, I think it's that direction, east anyway, you'll end up at York Avenue, which I think most people assume is named for the Duke of York, as is the city. But in fact, it's named for Sergeant Alvin Cullum York, the greatest American hero of World War I, and called by Marshal Foch, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, actually the greatest soldier of the entire war. And so that's quite a memorial. So once upon a time, as I said, it was tremendously important to people in this country to remember that war. And so it's very strange to me that that war is so thoroughly forgotten in this country. And to bolster my case for saying that the war is forgotten, when I set out 11 years ago in 2003 to see if I could find and interview any living American veterans of the First World War, the war had been over for 85 years at that point. I did the math in my head. I knew that somebody who was 85 or was 20 years old in 1918 would be 105 in 2003. A little daunting, but I figured there might be a few. So I called up the Department of Veterans Affairs in Washington, and in my naivete, I assumed that they would have a spreadsheet all ready to send to me with the names and ages, addresses, phone numbers, next of kin, et cetera, of every living American veteran of World War I. And I was told quite abruptly that they had no such spreadsheet, they had no such records, and that even if they had, they couldn't share them with me because of privacy regulations. And for years I thought they were just kind of brushing me off. And then about 3 years later, I started getting calls from people at the VA asking me if I had a list of living American World War I veterans and if I would consider sharing it with them, which was kind of a delicious moment, as you might imagine. And so I kind of struck out on my own, hoping to find some wherever I could, and had absolutely no luck at all for about 3 months. And then I got my first big break in the search from a really unexpected source. This is the Légion d'honneur, the Legion of Honor. It's the highest award that the government of France gives anybody. And in 1998, so 5 years before I started this search, President Jacques Chirac decided that France would award this beautiful medal and a very impressive certificate about this big to any living American veteran who had served on French soil during World War I. And they undertook an intensive search. This wasn't just PR. They had a big advertising budget. They ran ads in newspapers and magazines around the country. They enlisted the help of the VFW and the American Legion. And in 1998-99, they ended up giving out about 550 of these. And when I learned about this, I called up the French embassy. And knowing a little something about France, I knew that they didn't have the same privacy regulations that we did. So I called them up and I asked if if they kept records of people they gave these to, and if so, would they consider passing my name on to some of them? And I was passed along to an adjutant at the embassy, a fellow named Nam Do Kao, half French, half Vietnamese. And he was scheduled to be rotated back to Paris in about 3 weeks. But when I told him what I was trying to do, he was so moved by this that in his own free time, he photocopied all 550 successful applications for the Legion of Honor and FedExed them to me. And he wouldn't take a dime for any of it. And without that wonderful act of beneficence, this book wouldn't exist, because ultimately I ended up interviewing about 36 men and women between the ages of 101 and 113. And about 2/3 of them I found off what I think of now as the French list. And I should point out, this was the spring of 2003. You may recall, not a particularly good time for Franco-American relations. You might remember the term freedom fries. Yes, this was the spring of freedom fries. And yet it was the government of France and not our own government that gave me my first big break in tracking down living American veterans of World War I. The first veteran I found off the French list was this gentleman, J. Lawrence Moffett. He lived on Cape Cod. When I made plans to go up and interview him, I suddenly became very anxious because I thought, well, if we as a society have forgotten about World War I, how much is this 106-year-old man going to be able to remember of the war? And this became, this fear just grew and grew in me as the time for the interview grew closer and closer. I felt like the dog who chases cars all day and then finally finds himself in the driver's seat, with the keys. What was I supposed to do at this point? I mean, was I really going to talk to a 106-year-old man about things he'd seen and done 85 years ago? What a ridiculous conceit. So I drove up to Cape Cod. I got to his house, set up my video camera. We sat down and pressed play. And I started every interview that I did exactly the same way. The first question was always, what is your name? And then, when were you born? Where were you born? What were your parents' names? What did your father do for work? Did your mother work outside the home? If so, what did she do? And on and on and on. And things seemed to be going pretty well, but I was still fairly anxious. And then I asked him where he'd gone to high school, and I want to read for you his response, complete and unedited. I went to high school from Lebanon. That's Lebanon, Connecticut, a small town in the eastern part of the state where he'd grown up. That high school was in Willimantic, which was about 2 miles from home. And then I was directed to an insurance company in Hartford for a position and accepted. And I spent my life in insurance. I was hired by 2 companies, one then another. And I went to World War I. I graduated from high school in 1914. I went in the Army in 1917, in April of 1917, just before war was declared. And I was in the Army for 2 years, 18 months in France, in the 1st Division to go to France. The division was the 26th Division, made up of the National Guard of the 6 New England states. There are 4 infantry regiments in a division and artillery batteries with which I am not acquainted. And the 101st Infantry Regiment was made up of the Massachusetts National Guard. The 102nd was made up of Connecticut National Guard. That's where I was, in the 102nd Infantry. The 103rd Infantry Regiment was from Maine, and the 104th from New Hampshire and Vermont, and artillery mostly from Rhode Island. Let me just remind you, this man is 106 years old. And in Connecticut, we were all assembled at New Haven. All the different National Guard companies of Connecticut were assembled in New Haven in 1917, July. And from there we went. It was so early in the war, there were no transports. We went, my company and I don't know how many others, went by train, the CV, Central Vermont, to Montreal, and then embarked there and sailed down the St. Lawrence to Halifax, where we joined several other National Guard companies that were ready to go across, and went across to Liverpool. A 9-day trip it was. And then across the Channel to France, and then across France to a certain area, Landeville, and the regiment trained for 4 months there. And in February, we were sent to the front. At that time, the Allies, Britain and France and Belgium and others, had been in the war since 1914, and we joined them in 1917, and went to the front in February of 1918. So the first sector was the Allies at that time were defending themselves against the attacks of Germany. And we were just in defensive action. I was in the headquarters company of the infantry regiment and on the staff of the colonel, along with others. I had the rank of a corporal. And I escaped the front line, trench warfare, but I was subject to constant artillery fire. I spent my 21st birthday in the front line, March 6th of 1918. And I went out on patrol with a patrol group that night. And we spent 2 months in that sector, which was the Chemin de Dam. Well, that was our first sector. 2 months later, we were moved to another sector, the Tools sector. And then came Chateau Thierry in the summer of 1918, and then the closing war at Saint-Mihiel and Verdun. And the war was over, as you know, on November 11th of 1918. And President Wilson paid our company a visit while we were there and talked to us, and that might have, I don't recall now just when that was or what the occasion was, but it was maybe a holiday. So that was his response to the question, where did you go to high school? And I never worried after that whether I had bitten off more than I could chew and whether or not these men and women would actually be able to recall things clearly that they had seen and done 85, 90 years earlier. In fact, that interview went so well that I went back to visit Mr. Moffat a second time, which is the photo you see here. This is November the 11th, 2003. I went back that time because he told me during that first visit, which was July 20th, 2003, that he'd planned to ride in his town, Orleans, Massachusetts, in their Veterans Day parade. And in fact, he said he made a point of riding in every parade they had there. And I said, why do you do that? You're 106 years old. He said, well, I assume people like to see a World War I exhibit. And he was wearing on that day, you can see his original helmet from the war. Just a really, really fascinating guy. And a remarkable memory, as you've heard, but not, believe it or not, the most remarkable memory among all the people I interviewed. That distinction probably belongs to this gentleman, Sam Goldberg. There he is on the left in 1918 at the age of 18, and on the right, May 16, 2006, at the age of 106. When I met and interviewed him, he was living in Greenville, Rhode Island, where he had retired about 40 years earlier. Sam, when I asked him my first question, what is your name, this is how he answered. Samuel Benedict Goldberg. He was 106 years old and had the best diction of anybody I've ever met. And he also had the best memory of anybody I've ever met. He was born in Lodz, Poland in 1900, in March of 1900, and came to America in 1907, or as he said, December the 27th, 1907, on the ship Campania, C-A-M-P. He spelled every word that was more than about 3 syllables out for me, whether I asked him to or not. He was really a remarkable guy. He actually had enlisted in the cavalry and had a lot of very interesting stories to tell about being a Jew in the cavalry. And there he is with his horse, who did not have a name. The Army didn't name cavalry horses in World War I, just numbered them. But he liked his horse a lot, so he gave him the name Chickamauga, because he said the horse was so old that he'd been at the Battle of Chickamauga in 1863. Sam could remember every address at which he'd ever lived, the precise dates that he had moved to and from those addresses, every job he'd ever held, the precise dates he'd started and left those jobs, and exactly how much he'd been paid at those jobs. He was a force of nature. There's no other way to put it. Another person whose memory really was remarkable, but in a different way, not in terms of detail, but in terms of what it represented, is this gentleman, Moses Hardy. And if he looks a bit older than Lawrence Moffat and Sam Goldberg, he was just a bit older. This photo was taken the third time I visited him, January the 6th, 2006. The occasion just happened to be his 113th birthday. Moses Hardy was born and lived his entire life, all 113 years and 50 weeks of it, in Aberdeen, Mississippi, which might make you wonder, were his ancestors slaves? And I can tell you that, yes, indeed, his ancestors were slaves, and also his parents. Moses Hardy's parents were not only born slaves, but were fully grown adults when they were emancipated by the 13th Amendment in 1865. And in 2006, the era of HD TV and Wi-Fi and all kinds of other wonderful modern things, I sat down and visited with him for the last time, this man whose parents had been born in the 1830s and 1840s. That gives you an idea of the reach of American history. Mr. Hardy had a particularly interesting story to tell. I had a very difficult time tracking down African-American veterans of World War I. In the end, I ended up interviewing 2, but it took a very long time to find even the first. I had found one in Las Vegas who was 109, and his niece told me that he was very sharp and would be happy to talk to me, but when I got there 2 weeks later, he was unconscious in a hospital bed and died the next morning, which was not the only time that happened to me, but at least it happened in Las Vegas. If you're going to be stranded somewhere, it's as good a place as any. But finally, I did get to meet and interview Mr. Hardy, and he had a particularly interesting story because he served in an unusual type of unit for African Americans. The vast majority of African Americans who served in World War I were in labor battalions and were not armed. But Mr. Hardy happened to be in what was known as a pioneer infantry regiment. They were combat engineers, worked very close to the front, and thus were armed with Springfield and Enfield rifles, and were trained in combat, and were prepared to actually be used in combat should the situation call for it. This is a very unusual thing for African American troops. As I said, the overwhelming majority of them were never armed, never got close to the front, and so this was a point of great pride. Sometimes memories, though, could fail in spots where you might not really expect them to. That happened in particular with this gentleman, Bill Lake. There he is on the left in 1919, right after the war, at the age of 23, and on the right, October the 20th, 2003, at the age of 107, when I went to visit him in Yakima, Washington. He was actually just 10 days shy of his 108th birthday. I liked Mr. Lake a lot. You can just tell by looking at him that he was a fun guy to talk to. He got dressed up for the interview and just could have gone all day. But we hit a bump very early on in the conversation, very, very early on. He was fine with his date of birth and where he was born. But when I asked his parents' names, he was very quick. He said his mother's name was Emma Briscoe. And I said, well, how about your father? And he said, my dad. My dad. And this pained look came over his face, and he told me that around 1901, 1902, when he was 6 or 7 years old, his father had left the family home near Hannibal, Missouri, to go off to the Oklahoma Territory to see about some land for homesteading. And Oklahoma wasn't a state yet. And while he was there, he'd fallen ill with something and had returned home just in time to die. And leaving his wife with 8 very young children, the youngest of whom was an infant. And but the worst part about that awful story is that more than a century later, Mr. Lake could not remember his own father's name. And it was a very painful thing for me to witness. It made me hate myself a little bit just for asking a simple question like, what is your name? That I shouldn't have expected would be so troublesome. But we got back into the interview. I had lots of questions to ask, and he quickly forgot that moment, and things were going very well. And he had a very interesting story to tell. He'd actually been drafted. When America entered the war, he was going to go enlist, and his mother told him not to just sit tight. Maybe it would blow over. And a few months later, he ended up getting drafted, and he was put into a division, the 91st Division. He was living in Montana at the time, and the 91st were draftees from the Pacific Northwest. And he was put in the 367th Infantry Regiment's Machine Gun Company. It was a special company dedicated just to machine guns. And he had a particular job that he was trained for because he'd grown up on farms and was good with horses and mules. He was made the machine gun crew's runner. His job was to run back and forth in between the machine gun nest and the ammunition depot, fetching ammunition whenever the machine gun ran out, which, as you might imagine, was quite often. It was a very dangerous job. After artillery, machine guns were responsible for the highest number of casualties in World War I, and so they were a very high priority target for the enemy, and the easiest way to silence a machine gun is to kill the ammunition runner. And so he could only go at night, and he could only go under cover of darkness. And there were he had a lot of stories, harrowing stories about things that happened to him on runs. One time a bullet shot off the heel of his boot. Another time one tore a hole through the tail of his coat, just a couple inches from his back. Another time, this is a story he told quite a few times, he was sitting on a dirt rise talking to a friend of his during a slow moment. And all of a sudden, the friend was shot and killed by a German sniper, just 2 feet away from where he was sitting. And I guess I looked kind of stunned because immediately he reassured me. He said, "Oh, we got the sniper." He said, "We went and found him. He was up in a tree. We didn't give him a chance to surrender. They just let him have it, and he fell out of the tree dead." And he told this story 4 or 5 times. It was obviously something that was very traumatic that he felt the need to sort of revisit and try to make sense of. This moment when his life had come down to a coin toss. And that's really how he saw it. This German sniper was going to kill one of them, and he chose the other guy instead of him. And that's how he referred to it. He said, he picked him instead of me. He kept saying that over and over again. But one of the most traumatic things to happen to him during the war actually happened even before he got to France. Right before his regiment and division shipped out from Camp Lewis in Washington State to head for the East Coast and then ship out for France, he discovered he had measles. And nobody else in his entire regiment, as far as he knew, had the measles. He had no idea where he'd gotten them. 85 years later, this mystified him. He kept saying, "I still don't know where I got them." And he decided to not tell anybody about it because he didn't want to be separated from his unit. So he rode a hot, crowded train 3 days across the United States with measles, didn't tell anybody, and then was halfway across the Atlantic Ocean before he was discovered. And once he was discovered, he was quite understandably separated from the rest of his regiment, quarantined. And when they got to England, he was put in a hospital for a few weeks while the rest of the regiment and the division went on to France. And finally, when he was sent over to France, he had to travel by train all day and then march for a good ways to catch up with his company, the machine gun company. And he got to the front. It was September the 29th, 1918, the 4th day of the Battle of Meuse-Argonne, the last great battle of the war. It remains to this day the deadliest battle in American history. 26,277 Americans were killed in a little less than 7 weeks. The battle started promptly at 5 a.m. on September 26, 1918, and lasted right up until the war ended at 11 a.m. on November the 11th. And he got there on the 4th day of the battle, and his division, the 91st Division, was right in the heat of it. And when he got to the front, he said the first guy he saw was the machine gun company's captain, and he couldn't have been happier. Everybody in the machine gun company idolized their captain. He was this kind of guy who was sort of an icon of the era, kind of a Teddy Roosevelt figure, a gentleman, scholar, tough guy. You know, he was captain of the football team at Purdue. After graduating, he'd gone out west to Seattle and had opened up a stock brokerage with a friend, was a well-educated, well-spoken young man, but he also was a really tough captain. Mr. Lake told me, he said he was the kind of guy who would never ask you to do something he wasn't prepared to do himself. And just all of the men idolized him. And when he got to the front, the first guy he saw was his beloved captain. He was so delighted, he immediately went to salute. The captain stopped him, he grabbed his hand. He said, "Don't salute. You don't know who's watching." He said, "Shake hands." And he shook his hand. And he got quiet for a second, and he looked down, and he said, "He was killed that night." And I said, "Was it a sniper?" He said, "I don't know. I just know he was killed that night." And I said, "What was his name?" And he looked just like he had when he couldn't remember his own father's name. It was the second time that day that I hated myself for asking a very simple question. But anyway, it was a fantastic interview. And you're not supposed to have favorites with interview subjects, but he was really one of my favorites. He was just a really great guy. He spoke in a way that people don't really speak anymore. This was an interesting part of the experience, was meeting people 3 and 4 generations older who speak in ways that people just don't speak anymore. One fellow was talking about where his parents had grown up, and he said, "I away." Who says "I away" anymore? Mr. Lake, he talked kind of like an old prospector from a 1930s movie, you know, kind of Gabby Hayes in a way, except more comprehensible. And I really enjoyed talking to him. And so when I found myself back in Seattle about 6 months later, in April of 2004, I decided that I would go visit him, even though Yakima was a couple hundred miles away. And I hadn't anticipated being there. And so I hadn't brought along my video camera or anything like that. So I was just going out to see him, not to interview him. But I went out to see him. He remembered me. He was really glad to see me. And we sat down and we talked again for a good long while. And I found myself interviewing him again anyway, even though I didn't have anything to record it with. It was one of those conversations that's half conversation, half interview. And so I did the thing that I did any time I had the chance to interview somebody more than once, especially somebody this age. I asked him a lot of the same questions I had asked him the first time, because there's a lot to be gleaned in the way somebody answers the same question twice. Are there discrepancies? Well, there's a lot to be gleaned in that. Do they tell the story the exact same way twice? Well, that tells you something about that story. Oftentimes, they would remember details that they had left out the first time. So it was a very useful exercise. While we were talking, and I was just asking him questions in no particular order, at one point, without even thinking about it, when he said something about his father, I said, "What was his name?" And as it was halfway out of my mouth, I wished I could stop, because I remembered what it had been like the last time I had asked him that. But I couldn't take it back. And without hesitating, he said, "Richard, just like yours." Just like that. And I was taken aback by that, but really quite glad. And so maybe 45 minutes later or so, when he repeated the story about marching to the front and seeing his old captain there as soon as he got there and going to salute, and his captain stopped him and shook his hand, I said, "What was his name?" And he said, "Worsham." Again, didn't hesitate. And honestly, you know, I think about this now because I went back to Yakima after Mr. Lake had passed away, and I went to see his daughter, Pat, who was 73 years old at the time. And she had some of her dad's papers, discharge papers and stuff like that, and I wanted to get copies of. But I went over to check over the names of his siblings, her aunts and uncles and parents and things like that. And when I said, "And your father's mother was named Emma, and your father's father was named Richard," she went. She was 73 years old, and she had never known her own grandfather's name. As long as she had known her father, he'd never been able to recall it. And I've confirmed this, by the way, with using census records. So his father was, in fact, named Richard. I can't explain how I got so lucky with a 108-year-old man. Memory is a very strange thing. The way I think about it is kind of like a combination lock, and that if you don't know the combination to a lock, but you have unlimited time, eventually all the tumblers will line up if you try every conceivable combination. And I guess that's the way I think of it with his memory. I just got very, very lucky. So now I had his father's name, and I had the name of his beloved captain. I went back to Seattle that night, and I pulled out a book that I had just found a couple days earlier in a used bookstore in Seattle. It was a history of the 91st Division. And in the back of this history, there are about 40 pages or so listing all the names of the men in that division who were killed in the war. more than 1,000 people, organized by rank. So if I recall correctly, there was one colonel who was killed, 3 majors, and 7 captains. And the last captain was listed as Worsham, Elijah W. So I opened up my laptop and I Googled Elijah W. Worsham. Here he is. Doesn't he look like the kind of guy I described? Just kind of a, sort of a gentleman scholar / tough guy. And there wasn't very much on him. But there was something on a genealogical website that I found very interesting. Somebody who apparently is distantly related to Elijah W. Worsham, who obviously didn't survive the war, was never married, never had children. But this person who was distantly related had something that I found particularly interesting. When Captain Worsham was killed on September 29, 1918, word was sent back to Evansville, Indiana, where he'd grown up. And a childhood friend of Captain Worsham's, who was not serving in the war, was very grieved by this and sent a letter to the Army in his grief asking for more information on how his old friend had died. And this letter made its way to France and was passed hand to hand until it ended up with Captain Ray W. Hayes, who was Captain Worsham's replacement in the machine gun company of the 362nd Infantry. And this would have been late October, very early November 1918. The 91st Division was still at the front. The war was still raging. Even so, Captain Hayes took the time to write a response to this letter from this childhood friend of Captain Worsham's, and I want to read it to you. I have it printed in full in the book. While Captain Worsham was in command of the machine gun company, I was one of his officers. Since his death, I've had the honor of commanding his company, and it is his company, known universally as Captain Worsham's company, and not the machine gun company. Inspired by his ideals and teaching, I am trying to run the company as he did, but no one can take his place. We first went over the top at Rendezvous des Chasses, and the first day advanced about 10 kilometers. We met with stiff resistance at Epinonville the next morning, and it was largely due to the captain's courage, tactics, and machine gun company that our division held out while divisions on our flank were forced back. During the 2 days of fierce fighting, we advanced some 8 kilometers until on the 29th we were held up. A small town by the name Gênes seemed to be the point of resistance, and about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of September 29th, the battalion to which we were attached was ordered to take the town. The magnificent manner in which it was charged and taken will never be forgotten by the surviving participants. Led by our captain, we followed the assault wave and, under his direction, mounted our guns on a ridge commanding the town, where we could use direct fire over the heads of our own troops. We had some wonderful targets, but were subject to direct observed artillery fire front and flank, the flank organizations having failed to gain their objective. After getting my guns in action, I found the captain firing a machine gun, the crew of which had become casualties. Under the cover of the gun he was firing and 3 others from my platoon, I removed the remainder of the guns forward to escape the heavy enemy barrage. Then I rejoined the captain. Shortly he gave the order to cease firing, our troops having advanced so far that it was dangerous to continue to fire over their heads. We continued to observe, waiting for dusk to advance. I left the captain to give orders to one of my gun crews. When I found him a few moments later, he was dead, shot with a rifle bullet. He had started forward, field glass in one hand, with rifle with fixed bayonet in the other. We advanced with leaden hearts and heavy feet to help reorganize and consolidate the line for the night, because that is what he would have had us do. It was 2 or 3 days before the body was recovered and laid to rest in a grassy meadow in the forest of Argonne, beside that of one of his lieutenants who gave his life the same day. He was your dear friend, you say. To us he was more. Peerless leader, boon companion, comrade, instructor, and friend. We mourn his loss in a way that words cannot express. His men and officers loved him as he in his wholehearted way loved them. The fateful German bullet cost the army a valiant leader and officer, a true soldier in every sense, robbed the government of a valuable citizen, and deprived all who were privileged to know him in the future society of a beloved friend and always cheerful companion. Pardon me, sir, for so much detail about an action that I was in, but I loved and admired the old skipper, as he will always be to us, that it is a relief to talk to one who, likewise, knew and loved him. I dream of him by night and think of him by day, and always, in my plans for his company, I wonder if he would approve of my actions were he here. Most of my military education, all my machine gun experience, was received from him, and perhaps his invisible hand is still guiding me in my effort to take his company home as he would have taken it. Even your high regard for Lige Worsham, the citizen, would have been increased had you known the Captain E.W. Worsham that I knew and served under. He understood men and by his own high ideals brought out the best in them. I truly sympathize with you in the loss of a friend. Sincerely yours, Captain Ray W. Hayes, Machine Gun Company, 362nd Infantry, AEF. Boy, I wish I could write like that. And in my more vain moments, I wish I could inspire other people to write like that about me. It really says a lot, I think, about what kind of a man Captain Elijah W. Worsham was, and how important it was that those who knew him felt that it was that he be remembered. And yet, if I hadn't just happened to have been in the area a second time and gone back and visited Mr. Lake again, and if I hadn't unthinkingly asked him for the man's name again, and if the fates hadn't aligned and the tumblers hadn't all lined up on that day, I never would have known his name, and I wouldn't have found that letter, and I wouldn't know anything about the man. I went to France for several weeks this summer. I don't know if any of you have seen, but I'm writing a series on American World War I sites in France for the New York Times. And so I went to France for several weeks this summer, and one of the things I did one day was set out to find the field in which Captain Worsham was killed on September 29, 1918. Using old maps and a fellow I know who's a very knowledgeable guide, I was able to identify it as this field. This, in the distance, this town, this is the village of Gênes, a very small village. And if this picture were a little bit clearer, you would see a church steeple in that town. This is the church in Gênes, very small town. This is my rental car. And this little tiny thing that you see here on the side of this church is a plaque. And I didn't notice the first time I visited Gênes in 2009. But this is the plaque, and it says, the 362nd U.S. Infantry, during the Great Offensive, which began September the 26th, 1918, took Gênes and the ridge beyond on September 29, 1918, and were the first troops to reach the American Army objective. In spite of severe losses, this regiment held the ground gained until ordered to withdraw by higher authority because it was so far in advance of the troops on its right and left. I was pretty stunned to find this, mostly because it's in English, and there isn't an awful lot in this part of France that you will find that's in English. At best, things will be bilingual, but most of the markers you'll find, even markers to American people and actions, are entirely in French. So it's obvious that this was actually put on this church by veterans of the 362nd Infantry Regiment. They wanted people to remember. In particular, they wanted Americans who they imagined would visit Gênes in great numbers in the future to remember what they had done there. I can say with confidence that I am probably the first American to have visited Gênes since World War II, I would guess, and I don't expect many more will be coming after me. My guide, who was not with me the day I found this, but whom I told about this afterwards and showed a picture of it to, he was particularly taken by the fact that it was still there. Because apparently the economy in France has not fared any better than the economy here since 2008, and people have taken to stripping monuments of their plaques for the scrap metal. So don't tell anybody about this. My guide, who I mentioned, who I first met back in 2009, a fellow named Jean-Paul de Vries, knows a great deal about this area, the Meuse-Argonne, and took me out one morning to a field that had just been plowed where he thought we might be able to find some interesting stuff. So much was dropped on France over the course of 4 years of war that in certain parts of the country, every time fields are plowed, things come up every time. And so the earth still remembers what we have long forgotten. And experts say that this will continue to be the case for another 200 or 300 years. So we went out that morning into a field that had just been plowed, and about 5 years ago or so, I found enough stuff searching that way to fill a good-sized padded envelope. But on this morning, I got really, really lucky. All of this stuff is stuff that I found during the trip to France, most of it on that morning. These are German Mauser cartridges, these are French Lebel cartridges, and these are American Springfield cartridges. This is a piece of ball shrapnel, this is a piece of not ball shrapnel, I guess I'm not sure what the official term is. These are 5 German Mauser Gewehr 98 8mm bullets in their original cartridges. And this is a Mauser bullet, this is an American 30-06, another Mauser bullet, this is a shotgun shell cap. All of this, I should point out, was just sitting on the dirt. It's illegal to use metal detectors for this purpose in France. This is more stuff that I found, bottles. This is the number one thing that you find from World War I anywhere you go in France are bottles. They're so common that people just don't even touch them anymore. They just leave them where they are. I think people spent a lot of their time in the trenches drunk, and understandably so. So this is a wine flask. This is a cognac bottle. This is from a schnapps bottle here. This is a German double shot glass because a single shot wasn't enough. This, believe it or not, and I've done research on this, that's a cocaine flask. Soldiers could go to their drugstore and buy cocaine and bring it to the front with them. This is a resistor, actually, from a German electrical plant from the war. And there's a comb, a piece of pottery. These were some of the most remarkable finds. This is a German bayonet, just sitting on top of the dirt, bent by a plow that ran over it. This is the handle of a German saber. This is barbed wire. Absolutely nothing rare about that in France. This is the base of a German 77mm artillery shell. This is the base of a German Minenwerfer, a mortar, keys and stuff like that. And I mean, I could have taken home 5 times as much as that. I found so much, but there was just no way to get it home. So, like I said, really, the earth is the keeper of the memory of these things. One thing that I really did want to take home, which I was prevented from taking, probably for my own good, was this. This is an American 77mm shell. And even though it looks cute next to my foot, it's more than enough to blow off the foot and the leg and probably the hip. And it's just there, sitting on the surface like this. And whenever I tell people about this, they say, oh, well, did you call the bomb squad? And the fact is that German police won't respond to a single shell. So much of it pops up so often that you really have to have a couple of dozen of them for them to bother to make the trip. And so what we actually did was my guide carries with him a can of orange spray paint always. And he just spray painted the shell and then stuck a wooden stake in the ground next to it and spray painted that, not for the police, but for the farmer, so he wouldn't run over it with his plow. But there's absolutely nothing at all remarkable about any of this. While I was in France, I went to a reconstruction of a German rest camp in the Argonne, and I met a fellow who'd become a bit of a World War I enthusiast, a fellow named Harry Rupert, who was Dutch. And this part of France, real estate is very cheap, especially compared to other parts of France and the Netherlands, and so a lot of Dutch and people from other countries retire to it, and when they get there, they often become World War I buffs. because there's so much history in the area. And Harry lives in a town called Châtel-Chéry. Châtel-Chéry happens to be the town where Sergeant York performed his remarkable feats of heroism on October the 8th, 1918. And they're very closely linked with Sergeant York. You can see the sign under the town sign says, Suki du Sergeant Alvin York. They actually have what they believe to be the trail that Sergeant York followed on that day, although a lot of people dispute that. Anyway, Harry told me to come by Châtel-Chéry one day, and he would show me around some sites, and he did, and it turned into it was a very, very hot day, and Harry is a man of tireless enthusiasm. So we spent about 6 hours hiking around in great heat, often through woods. And then he invited me back to his house. He wanted to show me some stuff that he had on his computer, maps of the area and things like that from World War I. And so he sort of set it up as a slideshow. And we talked while these things were being shown on the computer monitor behind him. And at one point, something came up. It wasn't a map. It was a photo. It was this photo. And the reason he had it is because that building in the back is the chateau in Chéry. It was actually an abbaye. It was a monastery for monks. It's a very old building, and it was used by American troops during World War I as headquarters. And so he had a picture of it. And he and I, this was just sitting on his computer, and he and I were kind of talking, and I was looking at this sort of absently. And you know, there's nothing really remarkable about this photo. But I started reading the caption. It says, troops left to right, Company E, and then it has the officers listed. And when I got to this name, Uli, I was stopped cold. It's not a very common name, but I knew it. I knew it because Lieutenant Uli was in Company E of the 805th Pioneer Infantry Regiment. And I happened to interview somebody who had been in Company E, just a couple hundred soldiers in each company, somebody who was in this photo, this gentleman, Moses Hardy, was in that photo. And this is what the abbaye looks like today. We went by and visited it afterward, and this is the photo again. And Harry Rupert, a World War I buff, if ever there were one, didn't realize in the years that he had had this photo and had looked at it, that these troops in the back were African American, because he couldn't see it clearly enough. All he could see were the line of white officers standing in the front. The only word that comes to mind is Dickensian. This is a Dickensian coincidence that, of all the, like Rick in Casablanca, of all the World War I buff houses in all the world, I walk into this one and see this photo that just happens to contain 200 of the 2 million American soldiers who served in France, and one of them was somebody I happened to interview the first time when he was 110 years old, 85 years after this photo was taken. So I left Harry's house in kind of a daze that afternoon, and I went down to Romagna, the town of Romagna, which is about 45 minutes or so away from Châtel-Chéry. Romagna happens to be where the Musargan American Cemetery is located. It is the largest American cemetery in Europe. It contains the graves of 14,246 men killed in the last 7 weeks of the war at the Musargan offensive. This is very interesting. This is something I actually found many years ago. It's a book of postcards, and this is one of the postcards. It says, "View of Argonne Cemetery at Romaine." This is from 1919, when it was still under construction. I can't imagine why anybody would think that somebody would want to receive a postcard like that in the mail. And interestingly, the rest of the book of postcards were all pictures of the destruction of all the villages in the area. So this was actually probably the cheeriest postcard in the book. But that's what it looked like back then, and this is what it looked like today. So there are 14,000 men, as I've said, which means that each of these 8 sections has about 1,500 graves in them. It's the kind of thing, it's like Hoover Dam. You can't really grasp it until you see it. It's so vast, and also so beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful public green spaces I've ever seen. So while I was there that day, I decided to go find the grave of Captain Worsham, and I did. And this is it. Elijah W. Worsham, Captain, 362nd Infantry, 91st Division, Washington. That's Washington State, where he enlisted from. This is DSC, that's the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest honor, second only to the Medal of Honor that anybody can get. This says September the 26th, 1918. As you know, because I've told you, Captain Worsham was in fact killed on September the 29th, 1918, which means that he was, despite the best efforts of Captain Hayes and the men of the machine gun company, Captain Worsham was already forgotten by the time this marker was put up. I often tell people that forgetting is really our default setting. And if we want to remember something, we have to really make an effort to do it. I did the best I could with the very small pool of men and women that I had to work with. And I'm glad I did it. And I'm comforted to know that in the future, I often get emails from people saying, please tell me you're doing this for World War II. And I always write back and say, you don't need me to do this for World War II. Plenty of people will be doing this for World War II. So that, I don't think we have to worry about being forgotten. And I only hope that the centennial of the war gives us an opportunity in this country to remember it better. And I hope that we will, because it was a tremendously important experience for the world, obviously, but also for us as a country. It really made us the country that we are today. So, and I couldn't have known that, honestly, without meeting and talking to the men and women who fought it. So, anyway, before I take questions, I just want to tell you, I interviewed everybody. Every interview I did, I recorded on digital video. And I have edited clips from some of those videos and have posted it up on my website, which you can find a link to on the back of this card. So if you'll pick up one of these cards outside in the lobby there where the books are, you can also email me through that website, and I would love to hear from you. So anyway, thank you all for coming. I'm happy to take questions, ma'am.
Can you tell us about any of the women?
I certainly can. I interviewed 3 women. 2 of them were among the very first women ever to serve in uniform in any branch of the United States military. This is forgotten today, but in 1916, there was a very large piece of legislation passed called the Naval Act of 1916. And it's very long and very dense and very detailed, and it's not interesting reading at all. It's just all the requirements for service in the Navy, many, many, many pages. But nowhere in any of those pages does it say that you have to be male to serve in the Navy. And early in 1917, somebody discovered this and pointed it out to Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels. And to his credit, Secretary Daniels let it stand. And so women, there was a program set up for women to enlist in the Navy. The rank was, technically was yeoman parentheses F, but they were commonly called yeomanettes. And there were, which sounds like something you get at the concession stand at the movie theater. But they didn't seem to mind, and their uniforms also were very, very dowdy. But they were 11,000 women enlisted in the Navy before the war was over. It was the only branch of service that women served in that war. It was the first time, as I said, women served in any branch. They were all discharged immediately after the armistice, whether they wanted out or not. But they became very active. Women were among the founders of some of the very first American Legion posts. And they agitated for the next generation of women when World War II came along. And they really opened the door to service in every branch of the military by women in World War II and to much better treatment. The third woman I interviewed had a very interesting story. She was 18 years old, living in the Bronx, the daughter of Swedish immigrants. In 1917, she was working as a secretary for Funk and Wagnalls when her boss told her one day to go downtown and take an exam. And she did, and apparently she did very well on it, because a couple of weeks later she got a telegram at her house at 1 o'clock in the morning telling her to report to Penn Station on December 17th and take a train to D.C. and go to work for the War Department. And the next morning she called up the War Department and asked if she could come after Christmas instead. And they said no. And so she went down on December 17, 1917, went to work for the War Department, took a cut in pay from working for Funk and Wagnalls. She had been living for free with her parents and had to pay for her own room and board in Washington, D.C. But she loved the work, and after the war was over, she went to work for the Veterans Bureau here on 34th Street, right across from Penn Station, where she had gone to Washington. And she had some very, very interesting stories to tell about working for the War Department, being in Washington during the war, and also some heartbreaking stories about working for the Veterans Bureau after the war, because, there was no GI Bill of Rights for World War I veterans. And in fact, there was no safety net at all for World War I veterans, except for optional insurance that you could take out. I think it cost $10 a month. And it was completely optional, and if you were maimed, it would pay you a small benefit. But a lot of people didn't have even that, and so they got nothing. But she would tell stories about men who would come in, and this is not even in the Depression, this is in the 20s, who would come in broke. They couldn't get work because they were blinded or deaf or PTSD or were missing a limb or something like that, and they would claim their small check, and sometimes they would get an advance on the next month's check, and then they would come in the next month and there'd be nothing for them. Her name, this is, the first question I ever asked anybody was, "What is your name?" And when I asked her that question, she giggled. So it just as hard as it is to see a 108-year-old man unable to remember his father's name, I think hearing a 107-year-old woman giggle is as close to heaven as you're likely to come in this life, because her name was Hildegard Eugenia Anderson Shan, and I guess she didn't get to recite it all that often, so she was really tickled that I asked her. But she was, and there's video of her up on the website too. She was really wonderful. So those are the three women I interviewed. Yes, sir. Well, there's a texture to memories that written narratives don't contain. And so a lot of what I learned was really just what it was like. And not just, what it was like to be in a trench, what it was like to move in the middle of the night positions without even the moon to guide your way. What it was like to be afraid. But just, what it was like to be uprooted from this little town that you had spent your whole life in. You'd never left the county of your birth before, and go halfway across the world and meet people who spoke a language you couldn't understand. And they handled it different ways. One of my favorite stories, of all from this whole experience was a fellow named Art Fiala I interviewed. The first time when he was 104, and the second time when he was 106. And the second time I interviewed him, he said that one day he and his buddies had wanted to get something to eat. And they went to a little cafe, French cafe, in a little town somewhere. And none of them spoke a word of French. So he said, so we just sat down at the table and we started clucking like chickens. He said, and that's how they knew we wanted eggs. And I said, so you just sat down at a table and started clucking like chickens? I said, what if they brought you a chicken instead? And he said, well, that would have been okay. So I think what I learned, one of the most unexpected things I learned is that 106-year-old people are not really all that different from the rest of us, some of them use some pretty salty language. Some of them told some pretty racy stories, most of which didn't actually make it into the book, but, maybe there'll be a sequel, the Last of the Doughboys 2 by Anonymous or something like that. And that was something that I was glad I learned early on, because I think if I hadn't, I would have been so overpowered by this sense of awe in their presence that I might not have been able to interview them as well as I did. But Lawrence Moffett, the first person I showed you, the first time I went to interview him, and this is very, very early in the process, he lived with his daughter on Cape Cod. And I had a list of questions that I asked, and I varied from the list, and I asked follow-up questions and things like that. But I'd been talking to him for a few hours, and all of a sudden his daughter announced that she had to go out and run some errands and pick up her granddaughter and this and that. And I was seized, when she said this, I was seized with terror, because I thought, oh my God, what if he dies while she's out? He looks fine, but he's 106, it could happen at any time. What if how am I going to explain that to the police? Am I going to get to go home tonight? Or, and so I decided I would just sort of sit there and talk to him until she came back. Basically keep him alive with conversation. And, but I was getting pretty close to the end of my questions when she said this, and so I really had to wing it. And I'm really glad I did, because those are some of the best questions I came up with. I asked him, do you remember the first time you saw a car? He said he didn't remember the exact first time, but he said when he was a kid in Lebanon, Connecticut, in a one-room schoolhouse, cars were so rare that when you heard one, everybody was allowed to get up and run to the window and watch it drive by. Isn't that great to hear a story like that in 2003? Do you remember the first time you saw a plane, the first time you voted? At one point, we got to talking about the internet. And he said, yeah, I keep hearing about the internet. What is it? And I said, well, and I started to describe it to him, and he said, is it something you join? And I thought, immediately I knew where he was coming from, because this is a man who'd spent his life in the insurance industry. He'd lived in Connecticut, but he'd commuted often into work in New York. He belonged to a couple of insurance men's and businessmen's clubs. That's what people did back in that day. And so that's how he saw the world, things you join. And I explained, no, you subscribe. And I said, you have to have a computer. He said, oh, I have a computer. And I said, and so I started telling him about it. I said, I think you'd like it. And he nodded for a second. He said, well, I have plenty to do. Do I need it? And I said, no, I think you've made it this far. You'll be okay. But another question that I hadn't anticipated asking him, that I just asked him, on the fly, because I was terrified to leave him, was, what's it like to be 106 years old? And he said, it's not like anything. It's not any different than what being your age is to you. And I think that really colored the way that I proceeded, And so I think that was the most important thing I learned, is that, doesn't matter how old they are. They're really, people are people. So, yes, sir. Well, nobody told me they thought it was a bad idea. I did ask them if they were, surprised or disappointed that World War I didn't end up being the war to end all wars. And I think they were. I think they were, a lot of them were very idealistic, whether they were drafted or enlisted. And the Army was composed, it was a pretty even split in World War I between draftees and volunteers. And in fact, one of the most celebrated divisions in World War I was the 77th Division, which was composed entirely of draftees from the city of New York. My grandfather's. The Lost Battalion was in the 77th Division, and was he really? He was in the Lost Battalion? Oh. Yeah. So, they were one of the most celebrated divisions in the entire war, and they were all draftees. But a lot of them, whether you were drafted or not, really had no bearing on how idealistic you were. And you really had to be idealistic to feel good about this war, because there was no Pearl Harbor for World War I. America wasn't attacked as a surprise. And one of the things I found that was very surprising was that nobody I interviewed had any hard feelings toward the Germans. American troops didn't hate the Germans, and the Germans didn't hate the Americans. There are many, many stories of the two sides having, perfectly amiable conversations across no man's land. Stories of Americans capturing German troops, and the first thing one of the captured German soldiers does is ask in perfect English how the Giants are doing this year, because they'd worked in Coney Island for 8 years before the war. There really wasn't that hatred. It was I don't know if it was a sign of the times or whatever, but that was something that I got. Not only was there no hatred, there was, I think, a tremendous amount of respect on both sides between the Americans and the Germans, and that was something that really did surprise me. So, yes. Mm-hmm. That is true, and I write about that in the book. There were a lot of people who changed their names. There were states where the teaching of German was outlawed. German Americans were forbidden from volunteering for the Red Cross because somebody spread a rumor that they were putting ground glass in the bandages. But that didn't translate to the troops, in my experience. So, yes, sir.
Idealistic at the time, they recruited volunteers, but how did they feel about their service all these years later? You use terms like forgotten generation and lost generation. You talk about the waste of trench warfare, the waste of troops by machine gun fire. But at the end of the recent book on first year of the war, and actually since 1940, he writes that no one who served whose account of the war that he's read felt that it was a waste. They talk about how they believe the history of the 20th century would have been so different.
Mm-hmm.
The Axis of Powers won. They did not subscribe to the war poets' view of the war.
Mm-hmm.
What about the veteran who did they talk about that?
It's a very interesting question. I had a very limited pool to draw from, and one of the things that you have to factor into that is that these people were all the very oldest people there are, and the very, very old are different from the rest of us, and from birth. I asked everybody for the secret to their longevity, and everybody had something different. The only one I actually tried was bee pollen, which is anybody here ever tried bee pollen? I don't think it makes you live longer. It just makes you feel like you've lived a lot longer. It's terrible, but they're very different than the rest of us. And one of the ways that they're different is they're very stoic. I think they don't look back. They don't second guess. They don't do regrets. Are they born that way, or have they adopted that? I don't know. But I will say this, the very first person I interviewed, even before Lawrence Moffat, was a gentleman named Anthony Piero, who was an Italian immigrant, came here in 1914 and was drafted in 1917. And he had some pretty harrowing stories to tell. And every once in a while, he was 107 when I first interviewed him. Every once in a while, after he would tell a story, he would punctuate it by shaking his head and saying, "It wasn't worth it," or "what a waste," or something like that. And it almost felt reflexive, you know? And he was the first person I interviewed, and when I asked him, I said, "What's the secret to your longevity?" He said, "I don't let things bother me. If something bothers you, you better get rid of it if you can." And I guess he kind of felt that way about the war too, but clearly he was ambivalent about it. But it was there was one other person I interviewed, a fellow named George Bryant, who I think had serious misgivings about enlisting. He was underage, so he had to lie about his age, and he was turned away many times. And finally, he made such a pain of himself that they just enlisted him to get rid of him. And he saw some terrible things, and I think was deeply ambivalent about having lived through those things. But for the most part, these were people who didn't really look back, and I think that all of them, even those two gentlemen I just mentioned, were always very proud of their service. I don't think anybody ever felt anything other than that. But again, this is a very limited pool and not a random selection. You know, if this were a poll, the margin of error would be quite high. So, did you have a question, sir? Yeah. Did I see? Oh, yes, sir.
Do you have any sense of what percentage of the population was in the service, particularly compared to when working in the States or World War II? And does that help explain why we don't remember it well, or is it a different group?
Yes, that was. Do I have a sense of what percentage of the population, the American population, was in the war during World War I, and how did that compare to other wars, and does that have any bearing on whether we remember it or not? Honestly, I don't know. I know that by the time the war ended, 4.7 million men were in uniform. I would say, I can also tell you that if you take the American casualties per day fought in World War I are equivalent to the American casualties per day fought in World War II. And so it was as costly a war. I would guess that enlistment was probably as high. I couldn't tell you about the Civil War. No, I think there are a lot of reasons why we've forgotten it, and I think, frankly, the veterans bear a share of the responsibility. These were people who grew up in very straitened circumstances for the most part. A startlingly high number of the men and women I interviewed lost siblings in childhood. A really surprisingly high number of them lost their fathers when they were still children. None of them grew up in houses, or were born at least in houses with electricity or running water. Life was hard for them, and they just sort of accepted it as the status quo. And I think that they didn't agitate when they came home. They just wanted to sort of get back to normal as quickly as they could, and they didn't draw attention to themselves. And I think we might remember them better if they had made us remember them better. What they did do was make sure that their children who went off to fight the Second World War wouldn't come home to the same dire circumstances that they did. They're the reason that the GI Bill of Rights was created. So, you know, I lose patience with the term the greatest generation, because the greatest generation, and believe me, I'm grateful to everybody who fought and won the Second World War. I'm Jewish. I wouldn't exist if they hadn't done that. But they get credit for growing up during the Depression and then going off and fighting and winning the Second World War. But it was their parents who went off and fought the First World War and then raised and fed and clothed the greatest generation during the Depression. I don't think that makes them any less great than the greatest generation. They just didn't attract attention to themselves. So, yes, ma'am.
When you're talking about President Chirac giving the Legion of Honor to the survivors, no one motivated him at any particular time he did that?
Well, it was the 80th anniversary of the end of the war, and I think he saw that it was really the last chance to really get a good number of people. And when you consider that there were 2 million Americans who served in France in World War II, and only 550 or so around to get the Legion of Honor, 80 years later, you know, he started not a moment too soon. But the French, and this is something that I discovered when I went in 2009 to France to do research and then went back again this year, the French remember World War I even better than the Earth remembers World War I. And they are profoundly, to this day, profoundly grateful to Americans for what they did in World War I. And it's if people think that the French don't like Americans, which I think is just projection, but if you go over to France and let it be and make it known that you're American, you'll be treated like a king. I was, and I don't have anything else going for me. It's funny when you talk to people. You know, if you ask them, do you speak English? First of all, the answer is almost always no. But then their question to you is, are you English? And they say, you know, are you English? And when you say, no, I'm American, their whole disposition changes. They're delighted to see you all of a sudden. And they really, they don't take any of that for granted. And frankly, I don't think they exaggerate the role Americans played in World War I. Something that really startled me the first time I went there and was reinforced the second time is what the Germans brought to that war. They had such a technological advantage. Their technology was far superior to the Allies. Their soldiers were better than the Allied soldiers. And you think to yourself, how did, you just walk around and you see the trench works they built with concrete, not dirt, and the pillboxes and, the blockhouses and everything, and you think, how did Germany lose that war? And I asked quite a few French people that question when I went back to France this summer, and always, 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 the answer was the Americans. And, yes? Oui. Yeah. Yeah, and they just have, absolutely not forgotten, and that's why he did it, I'm quite sure. Okay, one more. Who's got the best question? Well, you... Oh,
Perhaps add something to your very comprehensive remark of the First World War. And my father was a veteran of the First World War. And when he watched only a meager description of his service, and we never discussed later in life, I'm curious about his service, the records that he, the records that he did leave, I thought described the service of a heroic type.
That's right. Yeah.
That, firefighter that they had at the time,
Mm-hmm.
which was referred to as the belt label fire,
Mm-hmm.
the result of which was that the service records of all the World War I veterans were incinerated.
Yeah.
Now we talk about a forgotten generation, and the forgotten World War. There is no record left of their service at all.
Except individually. So, yeah. Yeah, and let me tell you, that was pretty frustrating in doing research for this book, too. But I just wanted to say one thing, which is that you said that you and your father never talked about it. I hear that from people all the time. But I also heard it from people while I was interviewing the veterans. Often their children would be present, and they would say to me, he's never talked about this before. And I don't know what it was. I think that maybe they were just so old that they were okay, finally, with talking about it. Maybe it was easier to talk to a stranger than to your own children. I don't know. But I was a beneficiary of, a tremendous amount of luck. You asked about the Times. Yeah, I've published 2 pieces already in the series. There will be 2 more. The series is called Over There, and it's for the travel section of the Times. The 3rd installment will be sometime later this month. If you email me through the website, I will be sure to email you when it's out. But about American World War I sites in France. So it's a very different experience to go to the places than it is to talk to the people. But they're really complementary experiences. So happy to answer more questions afterward if you have them. And thank you.